Hey, good evening, guys. Welcome to day 16 of this vlog. Today's episode will be a little bit about starting off with the national debt and then talking a little bit about Medicare and Medicaid and just the healthcare in the United States. So, this is kind of spinning off again of a TikTok video I made the other day where I said, hey, the three ways we can save the US government from going bankrupt, which at this point, I don't even know if I necessarily would care to do. I think, hey, if the government goes bankrupt, it loses that much more credibility. It loses that much more of a stranglehold on the citizens. In that scenario, it would maybe have to jack up taxes or inflate the money into non-existence. So I don't know if I'm terribly, although that would not be a great scenario because now you're talking about potentially some serious turmoil and then a strong propaganda campaign to blame the crisis on something other than government. So definitely not best case scenario. I think best case scenario is, hey, let's make a crash landing, let's right the ship. And so, in that spirit of course correcting, I made a video the other day and I said, hey, the three ways to save the US government from going bankrupt are as follows. Step one was to end Social Security. Step two was to end Medicare and Medicaid. And step three was to end all the foreign wars, offensive wars. Of course, we want to keep a strong military, or at least a strong DNA for a military, so that if we ever need to protect ourselves or in order to maintain a strong defensive posture, obviously we want to do that, right? Not everyone abides by the same standards as other countries, and so we want to be in a position to protect ourselves should we ever need to, right? But the idea of bringing our troops home and not occupying certain regions in order to, again, maintain a defensive posture, but not to expand the empire to the point of being over leveraged and not able to sustain it over the long haul. So I made a follow-up video about Social Security yesterday because in reaction to that TikTok post, I got a bunch of flack on, oh, you want to end Social Security and benefits to old people and retirees and put these people out on the streets. So it caused me to do a bit of a deep dive into the problems with Social Security and potential ways to make a crash landing to get us out of this program. And so next on the docket was the Medicare Medicaid issue, which is definitely a bit of a complex, I won't say complex, but maybe a little bit nuanced, or, and maybe it's just a little bit out of my expertise, right? I think I have a baseline understanding of the matter, but I could definitely stand to investigate this topic more and learn a little bit more about it in order to, support the principles that I was putting out there, or to modify them a little bit to kind of match the reality of the situation. And so I had done some digging and diving into Medicare and Medicaid, but to kind of start off, to frame the discussion, again, I think where people get lost is on the ethics of the discussion, right? The idea of a publicly funded or privately funded or capitalist versus socialist structure to providing healthcare, I think is getting a little lost on the focused on the trees and losing sight of the forest, at least from the start. And so I just wanted to back up a little bit again to frame the discussion, which is we can't afford any more government, right? And that's the spirit of my initial post was, hey, our government is so over leveraged and spends way more than it takes in that either we would need to tax ourselves into oblivion and completely kill any notion of prosperity that our society has built over a number of generations, or we would have to make some difficult decisions and make some hard decisions to course correct and in hopes that that would allow us to kind of get back on track with progress and prosperity and to continue to enjoy a sustained standard of living where of course there will be some people who will be enjoying more, and greater luxuries in life, and some who will be enjoying less. But I think we can all agree that as long as we keep progressing, that we will continue to enjoy luxuries that the generations before us did not get to enjoy. 50 or 100 years ago, the common person today isn't enjoying luxuries that the common person 50 or 100 years ago couldn't even dream about, right? And that's due to the constant progress of society. And so what's the best way to accelerate that? And what's the best way to or what's the best way to stagnate that and slow it down to the point of stagnation and a lack of prosperity and a stymieing of prosperity. So just a good reminder for anyone who hasn't looked at it in a while is if you Google the national debt clock, the US government national debt is now up to $28 trillion. The tax revenue that the US government brings in is $3.5 trillion, but the money that it spends is $6.8 trillion a year. And so that's a deficit of $3.3 trillion. And the top three budget line items of that is Medicare and Medicaid at $1.3 trillion, Social Security at $1.1 trillion, and foreign wars at $730 billion. So again, just to frame the discussion, like if I was looking at a balance sheet and an income statement for a business, I would go, "Oh my God, how did this business not go out of business or go bankrupt years and years and years ago, right?" And so I think a lot of economists, or like one of the guys that I follow, Peter Schiff, is probably thinking the same thing to himself. He says, he talks about his lack of confidence in the US dollar and things like that all the time. So, I mean, maybe it's because we're the world's reserve currency and we were once a hub of industrial might and manufacturing power that supplied the rest of the world and was a creditor to the rest of the world. So maybe those things are what has kind of propped up our reputation and we're sort of on the just riding the momentum of that. But I mean, eventually the chickens have to come home to roost. And so if we want to balance and, but I guess the kind of the common term is balance the budget, but if we want to shrink the size and the role of government so that it doesn't continue to leech the current prosperity that or future prosperity we may enjoy, or to release the shackles and the weight that we have to carry with this massive, bloated, out of control government, then we would have to start ending the biggest programs within the government, right? And so that is why I did that quick video on Social Security yesterday, because I don't think a lot of people really think about what it is and how it's paid for and how it's structured and the financial position that program is in. And so then the same thing is true for Medicare, Medicaid, or the healthcare system as a whole. There's a few key parts to it that I think are backwards and are items that should be addressed in order to relieve the American public of this burden that the government has put on them, right? And so, in order to end this program, so the same thing as the Social Security discussion is like, hey, this is a program we've inherited, so you can't just pull the rug out from anyone. You can't just take a switch and flip it the other direction and turn it off, and you know leave all these people who've come to depend on these programs hanging out to dry, at least in such an abrupt manner that they have nowhere else to turn, right? You want to do it in sort of an organized, an orderly fashion to allow time for people to transition over to a new system. So I kind of did a follow up to this post and saying, hey, the three ways that you would end Medicare and Medicaid, and also just a quick backup. So there's a few issues of government control, I think, that have distorted the healthcare market and made it what it is today, and so expensive and convoluted that I think people, in general, there's a common consensus that, hey, the healthcare system is messed up, it's way too expensive. And when I talk with peers, the typical answer is some kind of government answer. Hey, well, we just need to have this or that program, or these are regulations on insurance companies, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's just adding fuel to the fire, or that's just adding weight to the shackles that are slowing down the progress, that are limiting our freedoms when it comes to the healthcare industry to begin with, right? So I would probably point to three things that are hindering the healthcare industry. One would be the existence of Medicare, Medicaid. This and all government healthcare programs take up about 40% of the healthcare industry. This, from my vantage point, has somewhat of a crowding out effect. So, as the government sort of starts to take over a particular industry, it has, the prices that it sets and the taxpayer dollars that it dedicates to it. It completely distorts the market, and it makes it hard for private entities to compete with that. So it's sort of a self-reinforcing loop. The more government money you throw at it, the more, because we all know that any government program, it costs twice as much to accomplish the ends that it sets out to accomplish. So not only do you have taxpayer dollars going to pay double for whatever service that the government's supposed to deliver, now it makes it harder for the private industry to compete within that space. So that's one. I think that's definitely a big one. And then there's number two that I would point to. Well, two and three would be the regulations surrounding healthcare, and then the tax code that incentivizes employers to compensate employees with healthcare rather than with, straight up cash compensation. So with the first one, I think that it's pretty, I would say, almost self-evident, in the same way as any other, regulating any other industry. When you apply arbitrary, cumbersome rules and regulations to an industry, you're going to have an added burden, just straight up an added unproductive cost to that industry, in order to just straight up comply with the regulatory burden, right? So now, again, you're having to hire lawyers, you're having to hire an administrative staff for people to monitor compliance internally, as well as to interface with the government agencies to say, yes, we've checked all the proper boxes, we're we have all the standards in place. So completely non-value added, complete waste of resources. So just that regulatory burden adds a cost to the industry that ultimately the end consumer has to carry that cost, right? So that's one aspect that's, I think, really detrimental to regulating any industry, but especially you see it in the healthcare industry. And then the other aspect of that is just the arbitrary rules that are put on different aspects of the healthcare industry. And at one time, I was looking into, I think it was the ACA, which of course now the Affordable Care Act. I think it was when I was looking into just different details about it and the random arbitrary rules that are put on insurance companies that, hey, each of the plans that they have to provide have to be either an A, B, or C type plan, and they all have to include these different types of services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and it's those types of limiting rules and laws that handicap a particular industry to where, and they're completely arbitrary, and it makes it more expensive for everyone. So now, because now if I have to include, if I was a person that wanted health insurance, but I only wanted a one-dimensional health insurance, just to cover catastrophic injuries or whatever it is, well, that technically should be cheaper than any other plan that's going to include all the bells and whistles of a particular healthcare plan. Well, now if you require everyone across the board to have all those bells and whistles, that's just going to raise the price of everyone's cost of purchasing that service, right? So this is where those regulatory burdens are extremely counterproductive. And then the third one that I was actually just watching a Peter Schiff YouTube clip. Again, as I was just perusing and just kind of watching and reading different things on the subject, being the tax code that gives a tax advantage to people being compensated through healthcare rather than compensation. That again distorts the market, because if you're incentivizing employers to pay and employees to accept compensation in the form of healthcare because there's a tax advantage to it. Well, now if I'm an employee and I'm being compensated in the form of healthcare or in something that can only be applied to healthcare, well, I got this tax advantage money and it can only go to healthcare. Well, I might as well spend it. Well, now you're having an increase in demand on healthcare services that, again, if it was just straight up compensation, I could decide whether I wanted to spend on healthcare or housing or food or whatever else I want to spend it on, then there wouldn't be that manipulated increase in demand. And anytime there is a manipulated increase in demand, well, that is a strain on the existing supply. So prices have to go up to, again, regulate the amount of people that can purchase that service. So all those things being said, those are three different ways that different government programs have completely distorted what the healthcare industry in the United States is. And ultimately what I was arguing for online is, hey, I think that the most ideal system across the board, this isn't specific to healthcare. I think I'm finding that my mentality is wherever we can gain ground back and erode away the control that government has on any industry and any aspect of our lives is a good thing. And reading the Constitution of Liberty by Hayek, he talks about just the freedom for freedom's sake is it creates innovation and progress that you wouldn't otherwise know. The more you narrow people in this narrow channel in which they're allowed to operate, the less progress you're going to have, the less creativity and innovation that you're going to have in any aspect of life. And that is a net negative for all of us. We should want people to have the most freedom possible so that they have the freedom to innovate, and we will all benefit, and it'll come up in surprising and novel ways that we weren't necessarily expecting. So, and that's definitely true for healthcare. And so the sort of 3-step plan, if you will, that I threw out as a quick and easy, more just kind of ideological mentality on how you would right this wrong, how you'd fix the ship and turn it around, specifically the healthcare industry, it would be a three-part process, right? So step one would be to deregulate the healthcare industry. Obviously the publicly delivered healthcare services are a huge issue, but let's not even start with that. Let's leave those alone. And I'm so confident in the free enterprise and free American people and individuals pursuing their own interests that if you just completely deregulate the healthcare industry like they deregulated the airplane industry, and like anytime we've seen free people allowed to pursue their own interests, there's massive amounts of innovation. So cool, let's leave the public sector alone as far as step one goes, and let's just deregulate the healthcare industry. Let's release that burden from any private entity that wants to deliver healthcare services, and that will then also remove the barrier for entry for anyone who wants to enter the healthcare industry and deliver medical services. And now you're talking about a very competitive environment that's going to drive prices down. It's going to improve the quality of the service and the products. And to me, that step one is a quantum leap. We're well on our way. If you have this thriving and flourishing free private market with no government restrictions and people can just interact voluntarily as they see fit, that would be an amazing first step. And then step two would be to flip the public program on its head. So the way it stands now, as with most government programs, is it's a centrally planned and centrally financed operation where we all get taxed, some portion of our income, 3% of our income, to sponsor Medicare and Medicaid, and that all goes to Washington, D.C., and then there's committees and a bunch of government bureaucrats that then start to systematically dole out the money, and it gets wasted and in fraud, waste, and abuse along the way. And then eventually it works and winds its way into delivering some half-hearted, low-quality service to the American people. So step two, once you have this thriving private industry, is you flip the public sector on its head and you go, okay, whatever dollar amount is being spent per person, per beneficiary, let's flip it on its head. Rather than sending that money to the central government, let's send that to the individual beneficiaries, and then they can shop as they see fit. So and it's the same thing as the school voucher concept. If they see fit to shop at a public institution to get the services delivered to them, great. If they see fit to go shop at one of those private institutions that has now been flourishing because we've completely deregulated that market, well, then so be it. And then now within the public sector, you start to have some competitive forces. That's going to create some positive effects. Institutions that are providing a terrible service, those will lose all of their funding and get shut down. And ones that do a great job and compete and learn how to adapt to the new environment, they'll flourish and they'll continue to get patronized by American citizens. And then the third step to this quote unquote plan would be to then slowly and incrementally phase out the public program, or at least the public funding of it, over a reasonable amount of time. So maybe call it 5 or 10 years. You would just start to phase out that funding that's going to the public sector for healthcare, and then you would, again, all of those resources would then not be getting sent to the central government or sent to beneficiaries, kind of arbitrarily participating, but those resources would then be kept to the American people and then allowed to be more efficiently spent in a free market. And what you would be left with is a very kind of smooth transition from the cumbersome Frankenstein program that we have now to a completely free market where people would be able to purchase many healthcare services out of pocket because they're so cheap. They'd be able to purchase all different kinds of diverse and creative health insurance plans. So that would be the end state that we're driving towards. And then the one kind of caveat or thing to consider, which is where most opponents of a free market system are going to double down on, which is what about the old or incapable or people who can't take care of themselves, right? And that's realistically, out of the 330 million people in this country, that's a very small percentage of the population, but that's immediately where people want to go to as the basis for the argument, as in, hey, let's have the government own 40% of this industry because, one out of every 10,000 people is not in a position to take care of themselves. And okay, obviously there I'm 1 out of 10,000. I don't know if it's 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 500. I don't know those exact numbers, obviously, but the point being that it's a relatively small percentage of people who truly cannot take care of themselves, and especially if they had always lived in a free market system, that they would never, have put themselves in a position to be able to take care of themselves. So assuming we get to that end goal, where the free market has taken over, but there's still that small percentage of people who need help. Well, once again, we would have all those resources. We'd have $1.3 trillion a year back in the pockets of the American people, and in which case there would be room for charity, there would be room for large philanthropic efforts, and there would be room for families to be able to, in communities, to take care of their own, right? So as humans, we never lose that altruistic characteristic that we all have, but the fact that it's farmed out to the federal government right now, it dampens our ability to be altruistic, right? They have a monopoly on some of these altruistic institutions, and they do a horrible job at it, and they waste all of our money on it. Well, imagine if not all of our money was wasted, and not even money, but all of our resources were wasted, and we were able to manage it at a local level. We'd have much better outcomes overall. So there you go. I've ranted and raved, but this was just a topic that got pretty fiery, and lots of different kind of comments and debate that happened on this. And so I wanted to just do a quick summary of some thoughts on this, and then again kind of throw out sort of just a very crude big picture idea of what it might look like to transition away from the system. And again, not to mistake step number 2 for being the heart of my plan, that's being to still rely on public funding, because that's the furthest from the truth. I think that getting away from the federal government funding programs like this is the ultimate goal, but there may be just kind of a transitional period that we'd have to go through to get to that end. So all that being said, let me know what you think. I'd be really interested to hear from professionals in the medical industry, whether they're in health insurance or they're healthcare providers or they're beneficiaries of Medicare, Medicaid, any and all of the above. This is a topic I'm pretty interested in. So let me know what you think. Let me know if I'm missing anything or if I'm misinformed on any of these. But I think on the whole, if we are thinking about individual freedom and freeing up markets to deliver services, it's kind of hard to think on how the principle of that could be wrong. Maybe there's certain practical things I may be missing. So anyways, all that being said, hope you guys enjoyed this nice long weekend and are having a good and productive summer. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Thanks.